Thank you, David. Since we're a little bit over time, if it's okay with the committee, maybe we can go on to the second presentation, and then we'll have time for a full discussion of both of them.
Sure.
The next one, which is highly related to the one you've just done, is about Autism Brain Net, and that's with Allison Singer as well. So why don't we launch into that, and then we'll have some time for group discussion.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks, Tom. And I'm gonna just say a few words, and then we'll have Allison come up and give the bulk of the presentation. So I want to tell you about a new collaboration called Autism Brain Net. This is a collaboration between the Simons Foundation, Autism Speaks, and the Autism Science Foundation. And it speaks to the issue that we need to go deeper than MRI in order to understand the neurobiology of autism. So I've just spent a half an hour telling you that MRI is valuable, and I think it is valuable. It actually gives you the big picture. It's the 30,000 foot view of the brain, and I think what it will tell us is what parts of the brain are particularly important to look at in more detail. But ultimately, each voxel of the MRI has 50,000 neurons in it and hundreds of millions of synapses. So if we're ultimately interested in looking at, the MRI has, limitations. So if you could have a person or something in the imager for 30 hours, you might actually be able to increase the resolution substantially. But given that we're already working with children who are squirming and stuff like that, we're not going to be able to do better with the MRI. So the issue is that we really do need to develop a substrate of postmortem brain donations to look at the cellular architecture of the brain. And I'm sure you're all aware that this period of time between birth and the first few years of life is a period of time when the brain goes through these incredible maturational processes. Neurons mature, synapses are formed, connections are formed, and we think ultimately that there's going to be something in this process, or many things in this process, that leads to the disturbances that are associated with autism. But frankly, there just aren't enough brains available to do the kinds of sophisticated science that can be done. This is a bottleneck. And in order to understand the neuropathology, but even the genetics, as Tom was saying, some of the best genetics now is coming from tissue samples of brain tissue, and well as the neurochemistry of autism that might actually lead to pharmaceutical therapeutics. We're going to need to have postmortem brain material. So from what I've already said about MRI, some of the features that we need if we're going to get adequate postmortem brain material would be not just a couple of brains, but a large number of clinically and genetically well-characterized brains for analysis. We're also going to need appropriate control brains for comparison and well-organized cohorts to optimize research, replication, and complementarity. I'll say more about this in a moment. In consultation with many people in this room, we decided that the best way to approach this was to develop a regional approach where centers around the country and hopefully eventually around the world could reach out to their local communities, make them aware of the need for donated brains, and then actually enhance the quality of the donated brain by decreasing the amount of time between when somebody decides to make a donation and when the brain is acquired. Maybe some of you don't know that the quality of brain tissue for science depends on what's called the post-mortem interval, the time between death and when the brain can actually be prepared. If that is short, the tissue is actually optimal for doing research. If it's long, the possibilities for doing research start decreasing. So what we've established, again, with funding through the Simons Foundation and Autism Speaks, is a network. This is really the founding network. It was established this year. We have 4 sites in Sacramento, Dallas, Boston, and New York. We have 4 directors, all who are familiar with autism research or who have substantial expertise in neuropathology. So Cindy Schumann, a colleague of mine, is the director of the BEARS, it's Brain Endowment for Autism Research Science at the Mind Institute. Carol Tominga is at UT Southwestern. Matt Anderson is at Beth Israel Hospital, and Patrick Hoff is at the Icon Medical Center. We actually have just included our first international site in the Oxford Brain Bank, which is one of 4 brain banks in the UK, run now by Olaf Ansorge, has agreed to join Autism Brain Net. One of the advantages of this brain bank is that it's the brain bank designated in the UK to acquire control brains for the entire country. And so we hope that Olaf will help us not only in collecting autism brains, but in control brains as well. So where this stands at the moment is that these 4 nodes, 5 nodes now are established. We've created a website at autismbrainnet.org, and it has a lot of detail about the organization. It actually talks a little bit about how this is governed, and I won't go into that now. I should say, though, the one point that we've been absolutely consistent from the very beginning is that this has to be absolutely transparent. So nobody will have preferential access to these brains. In fact, the node directors don't have preferential access to these brains. They will have to make an application to Autism Brain Net, which undergoes review by a scientific review committee, completely independent from the node directors, who will judge the scientific quality of the application. And only once that's done will tissue that rates high, or will applications that rate highly get access through the network. And I want to say something about this development of cohorts, because this is actually a new strategy for autism research, although the Stanley Foundation has used this for schizophrenia and other psychiatric disorders in the past. And that is, at the moment, let's assume that there's this pool of brains. Well, what's been happening is if scientist A or scientist B apply for some brains, scientist A might get bits and pieces of these brains, whereas scientist B will get these brains. And the problem with a disorder so heterogeneous as autism is they may not come to the same conclusions. But it may be that both of their science is good. It's just that there's different things in different brains. So what we would like to do is approach this in a cohort strategy where we will establish through Autism Brain Net cases and controls, and that tissue will go from this cohort to all investigators. So you might imagine, for example, that an investigator wants DNA. Well, we will, within the Autism Brain Net, produce the DNA and then distribute it to the 10s or 20s or 30s of investigators that want DNA. And they'll all be starting with the same resource. We'll be doing the same thing actually with tissue sections as well. So the hope is that this will yield much higher level of replication and also complementarity, because all of the data will have to come back to Autism Brain Net, and we're committed also to sending all of the data to NDAR as well. So what would these cohorts look like? Well, we're still actually taking input on the problem is when you create a cohort, it's going to take a little time to create the cohort. And so investigators want tissue right now, and so they're sort of incompatible processes. But we're thinking of things like ASD versus age-matched controls, or ASD versus epilepsy versus age-matched controls, or perhaps genetically defined forms of autism like ASD with 16p11.2 deletion and controls. Again, no decisions have been made at this point in time. We want to get more input about that. So we're not starting from scratch. There aren't very many brains available at this point in time, to be honest. But it's not zero. And because of the autism tissue program that's been functioning over the last 15 years, there is actually a set of brains. It's a little hard to see this, but this is the age. These are just hemispheres that are available currently from individuals at these different ages that either are formalin fixed for histology or frozen for genetic or molecular strategies. And so there are brains available that we've inherited from the Autism Tissue Program, and I should say that Autism Tissue Program has sort of evolved into the Autism Brain Net, is a fully enfranchised partner of Autism Brain Net, hasn't gone away, it's just reemerged as Autism Brain Net. And what we're hoping by having the other nodes participate is that almost immediately we'll be having other brains. So that this is the number of brains that are available from the Mind Institute. So again, another 8 brains. Still a small number, but we actually haven't yet got this underway and appealed to the community. The final note that I want to make is that this is a really, really hard topic. This is probably the most difficult topic I've ever had to deal with. When you approach families and say, would you consider making a donation of your child's brain or your relative's brain? And I just want to say that we've had several experiences at the Mind Institute where the families come back to us after the donation process and they say, this was the most positive aspect of this whole terrible situation. We've had on our website, on Bears, there's a woman named Valerie Hund, whose son was 16, died of a seizure. She called us and said, I would like to make a donation. She's been one of our most vocal advocates because she feels that it helped her in her grieving process, that this made actually some sense out of a terrible tragedy. So what I think we need to do is sort of communicate this message better to the community. And I think that the Autism Brain Net will only be successful if the community is fully engaged. And the thing that I think will be different is that it's going to require a nationwide and maybe a worldwide outreach effort that communicates the message that it takes brains to solve autism. And I couldn't be more delighted than to have Allison Singer being the one who's shepherding this outreach campaign. So I'm going to have her tell you about what she's done thus far. Allison?
So as David said, in order to make progress in autism research in terms of diagnostics and treatment, we need to have access to the affected organ. That's how progress is made. And unfortunately, as he described, there are very few brains that are available for study. So I think as part of the Autism Brain Net, I really want to thank the Simons Foundation particularly for recognizing that reaching out to families to encourage them to donate tissue was a critically important piece of this project. It's great to have this organized network of nodes that will disseminate brain tissue, but if there isn't any brain tissue, there's not going to be much value to the network. So this is really a critical part. So when we started thinking about what are the best ways to reach families, to encourage them to donate tissue, we started by really surveying the materials that were out there to date. So there were brain networks, there was the ATP, there were other networks, and we looked at their materials. And most of those materials were focused on the process of research, that we need brain tissue in order to conduct research. And the materials included pictures that a lot of families found a little scary and, to be quite frank, just yucky. And when we showed them to families, they physically recoiled from some of these photos of actual brains that were stained blue, videos of the brains being sliced. And it was, again, very much focused on the process of research rather than what families respond to, which is the outcome of research. And so when we looked for something that would be parallel, we thought about organ donation. So organ donation has now become widely accepted. It's a very similar activity in that it starts off from a tragic event where, in the case of child organ donation, a child dies tragically. But the families have already thought about the idea that if something tragic happens, they would want, as David said, something positive to come out of this tragic situation. And so we wanted to use that as a parallel when we made our outreach materials for this campaign. And again, we wanted to focus on the outcome in that we wanted not to show the brains themselves, but we wanted to talk about the value of the research in terms of improving the real lives of individuals with autism. So this committee, the IACC, has understood the need to increase awareness about the need for donation. since 2009, the very first strategic plan, we've included the objective of having a targeted outreach campaign that spoke specifically to the value of donating tissue for research. And a few projects have been underway against this objective, but this, I think, is really the first large-scale project. And again, when we began this process, we had done a little bit of focus group research back in 2007 at Autism Speaks for the Autism Tissue Program. And so we started to hear from families that what they wanted to focus on was really the outcome of research. So we started this project by launching focus groups. I'm not going to get too much into the focus groups, but we did 4 different groups. We divided the families by age of their child, and then we did one group that's focused specifically on individuals with autism, because we're also, in addition to having parents consent to donate tissue from their children, it's also very important for adults with autism to consent to donate their own tissue. And we realized that their needs and desires might be different. So we started to talk to these families about the outcome of research and what types of materials would they respond to. And after talking about materials that were a little bit gentler and really spoke specifically to the needs of the families, we got some very good response. What you want to see after focus groups when you're showing families, when you're showing materials, is that people will take additional action. That's really the sweet spot. You want to show families the materials and you want them to do something. And so what we saw is that each of these focus groups contained 4 participants, and we had good response in all of the groups in that most participants said after seeing the materials they would think about the issue, they would go to the website, they would Google brain tissue donation, and we also learned that really our target is in this group the parents of kids who are 11 to 17. What we found in the earlier group was that those parents don't really want to think about brain tissue donation because they're busy getting their children into school. And this group was a little more focused on their children who were transitioning into the adult world. And so this was really our sweet spot in here. And here we had one adult who came to this focus group and basically said, there's no circumstance under which I would ever donate tissue. I don't even want to talk about it, who didn't really participate. So this 3 is really showing that all of the adults did respond well to the idea of tissue donation. The second piece of research that we did before we got underway is we worked with Harris Interactive to do an online survey just to gauge the general sense of what was the baseline level of awareness. So using Harris Interactive is basically an online survey where people sign up, they fill out a long questionnaire about whether they own a cat, what kind of car they drive, do you have a child with autism. So when people participate in an actual survey, they don't know whether they're going to be getting questions about coffee creamer or their experience with children with autism. So we had 412 people participate over the course of about a month. These were all parents and individuals with autism, parents who had children with autism or individuals who identified themselves as themselves having autism. And what we saw is that about 1/3 of people were aware. So, only 1/3 of people, even given the amount of attention that's been paid to tissue donation, were currently aware that they could donate brain tissue. Only 29% realized that they could donate that family members who did not have autism could donate tissue. And fewer knew that they could register to be a tissue donor before their child had an accident or they died. And this is really important because, again, when we think about the parallel to organ donation, the reason organ donation works so well and so seamlessly is because people have thought about the idea of donating organs before their child is in the PICU. So this was really the crux of this, is that we want people to be thinking about the need for tissue donation, the idea of donating tissue if something tragic were to happen, before they're in that mindset of their child has just had this tragic accident. Again, in the Harris survey, when we looked at questions of whether people would be willing to consider registering to donate tissue now before their child had an accident, we got some good response. So we had 51% of families who said yes, they would think about the issue and consider registering before their child, before they reached a time of need. 38% said that they would consider donating their own tissue or tissue of their child with autism. This was their own tissue, their child with autism, and this was other children. I thought that was kind of interesting. I think what this speaks to is that families realize the value of donating tissue of the affected child, but we also have to talk about the affected siblings. One thing I wanted to point out that I think was quite interesting is we asked some of the participants whether they would consider registering to donate tissue for a consortium where we talked about the branding of the organizations behind this project. And we said specifically, would you consider donating tissue for a group that was overseen by a consortium of the Simons Foundation, the Mine Institute, Autism Speaks, and the Autism Science Foundation, and several major U.S. universities? And the willingness to donate tissue went up. So I think there are two interesting ideas there. One is that there's the power of branding, that people feel confident knowing that the tissue would be used wisely. And secondly, I think another possibility is that this community has been so fractious on so many issues that I think when families saw that all of these organizations agreed on the need for tissue, that lent them some additional comfort that this was necessary and that the tissue would be used wisely. So this was the key question from my point of view. We asked people who participated why they would or wouldn't be willing to register to donate tissue. And here, 55% of the people we asked said yes, they would be willing to donate tissue, and their primary reason was to help other children. Okay, and the second reason was to support research, but this is really, again, parents are not focused on research per se, but on the outcome of research and on its potential to really make a difference in changing people's lives. And so that's where we needed to target the message of the outreach campaign. Of those who said they were undecided about whether they would donate tissue, this is also good news. A third of them said it was because they just were completely unaware that you could. So again, that is a group that with good outreach materials, we could potentially convince to donate tissue. And about a quarter of those respondents said they just haven't had time to think about it, they would need more information. So again, the top two categories are, I think, groups that with good outreach materials we can try to convince. There was about 18 to 30% who said they're just completely unwilling, they don't really want to think about it. 28% of them said it's just highly unethical to even consider donating tissue. They would not donate organs, they would not donate tissue. Now, I think this is a group that we will not convince. And then we had about 22% of the respondents who said, I don't want to think about this, I don't want to think about my child dying, and I really need to think about getting him into EI. So, you know, again, I think the parents of the youngest children are so overwhelmed by the process that they're not really receptive to the idea of donating tissue. And this is the group that says, just yuck, get away from me. So that's not really very easy to see. So taking all of this data, we created a campaign that really tried to approach the concept of very difficult, often morbid topic with humor and really tried to take advantage of what we had learned from the data we had collected. And we came up with this, it takes brains to solve autism, which is a nice double entendre. It takes smarts to solve autism, and it takes physical brains to solve autism. And the idea behind this concept is that families who are raising children with autism are heroic in their everyday activities and in their continued quest to do everything possible to help their children. But that families who take the extra step and register to donate tissue are superheroes. And so we're positioning this family that you see in the ad. This is the Matthews family. Christine Matthews is our spokesmodel. This is her adorable son, Casey, who's 16 and is diagnosed with autism. He is the sweetest, loveliest young man you would ever meet. And they are our superhero family, and they have all registered to donate tissue, and we hope that other families will listen to what the Matthews family has to say. They speak a lot about why they want to donate tissue on the website, and a video that you can go to, takesbrains.org, and watch and listen to why they felt it was important for them to donate tissue, why if something tragic ever happened to one of their children, they would want other families to benefit. And not just one family, the way organ donation would benefit one child, one kidney, one child, but that research has the potential to benefit thousands of families. And so in addition to the print ad, which you will start to see, we just released this in May, so you'll start to see it in Autism Spectrum News and in some of the university quarterly journals. We also launched this website at takesbrains.org. Again, we tried to be very, it's not a deep website. We have a lot of great information, but we really tried to just stick to the three key buckets: answering families' questions and individuals with autism's questions about the nuts and bolts of registering and what happens to my tissue, what happens to my child's body, things like that. What are the religious questions? So these are the questions, and as families go on the website and look at the questions, the answers come up underneath. The second bucket was really to try to focus on the outcome of research. Again, families spoke very specifically about their need to understand what is the valued outcome of the research that uses tissue. So in this area, we'll focus on the valued outcome, how families have been helped by this research. And then here we have our sign-up page. And again, the important thing to remember for families is that when you register to donate tissue, you're not making a commitment at that time. Okay, you're not, when I'm a registrant, I'm not committed now to donate my daughter's tissue. If my daughter were to tragically have some accident, I would need to give consent at that time. So the registration really means I've thought about this, and I'm making a commitment that this is an important thing to think about and to move forward with if a tragedy should occur. So we've already been out and about at many of the Autism Speaks walks, talking to families, registering them. I think we've registered over 300 families already at just 2 walks to donate tissue. When you talk to families about this and you talk about the need for tissue in terms of moving the research forward, and that lack of tissue is one of the greatest rate-limiting factors in autism research, they really do respond. But it does take having that conversation and approaching it in a family-friendly way and an understanding of what the family's goals are. So I hope everyone who's watching at home and everyone who's here will take a moment to go to takesbrains.org and register to donate tissue. It literally takes 5 minutes. There are only 5 fields because, again, you're not actually consenting to donate tissue. What you're doing is reaffirming that this is something you've thought about and this is something that you want to make a priority in terms of your family's commitment to research. So again, I want to thank the Simons Foundation. They are one of the partners in Autism Brain Net, but they specifically sponsored the outreach component. It's been wonderful to work with them, particularly Jerry Fishback at the Simons Foundation. So I will leave it at that, and if there are questions, I hope David will join me up here to answer questions about Autism Brain Net and the takesbrains.org.
Well, thanks to both of you. We're a little bit over time, but let's take a few minutes for questions or comments. John?
I'd like to thank both of you for your efforts, and I actually have a comment that relates to both of your presentations, David. One of the things you spoke about was brain imaging studies of optimal outcomes. And what wasn't really made clear, but I think is true, is that optimal outcomes are really observed in adults who go out and make their way successfully in life and turn autism to either be an advantage or they minimize its disability, depending on what aspect we consider. That would be, I think, the universally agreed optimal outcome. Mm-hmm. And that says that you need to be doing MRI studies of adults to find that, but you've made clear that MRI has its resolution limits, and therefore that same optimal outcome research has to be done on adults. And one of the things that is not really coming through in this initiative, in what I've heard so far, is the, first of all, the recognition that most of the autism community consists of adult people. And when we talk about families and donations, most of the donors potentially should be people like me, not people like a 6-year-old son, if I still had a 6-year-old. And I think that we really need to make a stronger effort to get those adult brains. I think that we need to make an effort to get a spread of brains across the autism spectrum. One of the things that concerns me is that when we look, for example, at how we defined autism 10 years ago, and we look at the samples of brain tissue that would have been donated at that time based on that understanding of autism, we would end up with a set of tissue samples that were disproportionately skewed towards the much more severely impaired end of the spectrum. And you already spoke at some length about how we are clearly defining several autisms, of which that is only one. So I think that we need to really deliver the message that we need tissue samples all across the spectrum, and we really need to be looking at those optimal outcomes from those tissue samples, because I absolutely agree with you. I think that that's a real question. We don't know why some people score so beautifully on tests and they cannot get employed, maintain a family, be independent adults. I agree. We don't know that. We need to know, and I think that this is a key step, and I think we need to expand the initiative to address it.
So in terms of the outreach, when we started doing the research, we recognized that we needed brains from both children and from adults, but that the message to families who are thinking of donating their child's brain is very different than the message to an individual with autism who is an adult and self-consenting. The next step of this project, now that we've done the ad and the video for the family, is to do a separate ad specifically for individuals with autism, themselves with autism, featuring an adult with autism, talking about, we haven't cast it yet, but the reasons why he or she has registered to donate his or her own brain. And what we heard from the individuals with autism in the focus group was very different than the parents of children 11 to 18. They were willing to donate and interested in donating their brains because they wanted scientists to think that they were unique and different, and they wanted people to learn about why they were different and what made them unique. So that will be the focus of that new ad. It won't be the superheroes. It will be, you should think about donating your brain because scientists think they're really unique and cool. So that is the next step. But we absolutely recognize that that is a key constituency, and we're moving there.
I think that we need to speak for our own community as autistic people, just as when I look at other diseases, for example, that affect certain ethnic groups, and the people who speak on behalf of that research are members of the affected group, and I think it's great.
Absolutely. The Matthews are a real family, and we looked at many real families, and for the ad for adults, it will be an adult who is diagnosed with autism talking about why he or she thinks it's important to register to donate.
And you've raised a good point, too, that we have, we want to show the world maybe why we're special, but we also, I think we need to be realistic and recognize that we have specific medical problems associated with autism. We have challenges in daily life, and I think we want to be seen as special, we want to be respected and accepted, but we want help solving those problems, and this is a pathway to achieve that goal. And I feel very strongly that our community needs younger adults, older adults. We need to speak for ourselves in this matter. It's very, very important. And I absolutely support what you're doing. I just would add to that we need to be our primary speakers.
Thanks, John. Lynn, you had your hand up?
Can I, Tom, just make one comment to what John said? Sorry. Because I agree with you that what we need to be doing is recruiting and then looking at the brains at all ages, at all severity levels. I think that there's actually different scientific questions that are most germane to different populations. So at least in my own view as a neuroscientist, looking at the youngest brains, either with imaging or postmortem, is probably going to get you closer to understanding, what is the etiology, what's the neuropathology that might lead to autism spectrum disorder. Whereas looking at older brains and individuals who have optimal outcome, now you're actually starting to deal with issues like, what is the compensation? What's the reorganization? What's the plasticity that leads, as you say, to individuals going on to having a high quality life? I think that they're slightly different questions, both extremely interested. In fact, I'm getting much more interested in the issue of plasticity and compensation. So I do think that this initiative needs to reach out to all portions of the community, parents of individuals who are low functioning, but also people on the spectrum. And we're a new effort, and we really welcome, I think Allison and I both really welcome input from the community about how we can get this message. The message is not going to be scientists talking to scientists. We already agreed on that. It's going to be family members, it's going to be self-advocates bringing the message. And we see this as, the community being the ambassadors about the need. In the state of California, we've estimated that every year there's 50 individuals on the autism spectrum that pass away. Yet the number of those brains that are coming into research are minimal. Right, and I think the reason for that is because people simply don't know of the dire need, the real bottleneck. We're stymied in doing research, and this is why I'm so delighted that Allison has developed this campaign, and we'll continue working together for the next many years to refine the message, to broaden the message, and to hopefully make people feel comfortable with the possibility of making a donation if circumstances require.
So we're way beyond time, and there are lots of hands up. I also want to point out that Tiffany Farchione and Jim Ball are both on the phone. We couldn't get their audio before, but we can now, so they may have questions as well. Let's quickly go around, and we'll just try to make these much briefer. Lynn?
Hi, real quick, I have a comment for Allison, a question for David. Allison, I worked a few years ago at the Autism Research Institute and the Maryland Brain and Tissue Bank to try and increase donation, and one of the avenues that we took was to reach out to medical examiners. And, you're saying that of the 50 that die, you make it one. The medical examiners are in a perfect position. So increasing awareness with that group. Many of the children who die accidental, they're going to have autopsies already. They're in a perfect position to be able to ask the families about donating brain tissue, and many of them were not aware. The other obstacle we ran into is they did not have freezers. So the Autism Research Institute actually was purchasing freezers to go into these areas. So the ones that had agreed to obtain tissue, the only thing they needed to do was alter their intake questionnaires to ask the question whether or not the child had been diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. Along those same lines, we found that you need to be very careful with the control brains, and that autism is a spectrum of disability. And some of the studies, the control brains were actually children that had ADD, ADHD, developmental language delays. And one study, there was a control brain from a 13-year-old that had committed suicide. So we need to be very careful with what we specify as a control brain. So I just wanted to offer those caveats to don't forget the medical examiners. The Autism Research Institute has wonderful posters, very colorful, that we mailed out to the medical examiners, but there needs to be follow-up. I actually went in person and met with the medical examiner in the state of Georgia, and he was very receptive. Having a family person go to talk to them about this need also was something that really motivated them. David, a quick question regarding the brain overgrowth you're seeing at 4 to 6 months. I was following some of Martha Herbert's work, and she was finding those exact same findings in the 4 to 6 month old, and that those abnormalities in the growth seem to be driven by the white matter increase in the brains, and she saw that exact same pattern in children with developmental language delays. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more in terms of what might be driving that overgrowth at 4 to 6 months, and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so we don't actually do the MRIs at the 4 to 6 months. That's just based on head circumference. We have a little bit of data, although it's only on 55 kids in an infant sibling study, and where we also saw brain overgrowth. In that study, which again is more limited, where it's not the increase was not limited to white matter, it was actually gray matter and white matter. What causes that, I think we have absolutely no idea, and I think this is actually one of the huge unanswered questions. For those kids who have big brains, what is it? And again, I don't think MRI is going to answer that question. We actually have to get down to looking at tissue samples, and that just hasn't been possible without the tissue. So I think it's a replicated finding. I think we can come up with some subtle differences in terms of, I know Martha's focused on white matter. We see it in both gray matter and white matter, as has other groups. But what's the underlying cause of that? And is it more neurons? Is it more glial cells? Is it inflammation? Is it edema? I think we just don't know at this point in time.
David, before we go on, just a clarification about Lynn's question. You said that the group with the large brains,
Yeah.
who also were more likely to have the large heads at 4 to 6 months, were
Yes.
regressive.
Yes.
So even though you're calling them regressive, there's some abnormality that's being picked up at 6 months of age.
Yeah. And so, that was the surprise to us, that, at 12 months of age, typically you wouldn't see any behavioral manifestation. Maybe with some of these newer, more sensitive behavioral assays, but you don't actually see any behavioral alteration until the kids are much older. Yet they're obvious. And I think head circumference for these very young kids is actually a decent proxy for brain size. We also have some other additional data that there's some kids that have increased extraaxial fluid, the fluid between the brain and the head. So it's not a perfect proxy, but it's close. But you're absolutely right. 88% of the kids that had 88% of the kids with the big brains had a regressive onset. So it's much more associated with regression than with early onset.
Inshu.
Question for both of you. So Allison, another, again, you're talking about a very charged, sensitive, emotional sort of issue, which again, you cannot bring up at the time of, death. But again, another avenue to discuss this, I think, would be in the pediatrician's office, where again, just like our well child checks that we do, anticipatory guidance that we do for head injuries and skin care. I think for targeting the families that have children with special needs, especially ASD. I think that would be a dialogue to have at that point, and introduce the concept, with the flyers and this and that, and so that, if unfortunately that event happens, then at least it's not a new concept, and it's not going to be something that's, just negatively taken. And I think that it would be something, again, it's an easy enough thing to do. And again, so vitally important, and people just don't think about it because it's just not, it's just not, it's so emotionally charged. David, I had a question about the head circumference. Again, I'm always excited when I hear about some very simple biomarker that I can do in the office that can help me, determine treatment plans and just the next steps, and as well as just looking at risk factors and potentially offsetting some downstream effects. So again, with head circumference, I think that's a very nice, quick, easy way to sort of assess alterations in development. But again, I wonder about just benign macrocephaly. Kids with big heads have parents with big heads, and uncles with big heads, and grandpas with big heads. So and how your findings might correlate with just that population, or the children who have developmental coordination disorders that may also very often have larger size heads, and and how the findings specifically that you're seeing for the ASD population, and how that might correlate with other groups of children with larger size heads that may not be ASD in nature.
Well, so I think unfortunately it isn't going to be the biomarker that defines autism. Again, just we find the big brains in big heads in 15% of boys. I want to try and get that point across, that it's actually a minority of boys in our sample that have the big brains. We have found that those kids, when we image them at 6 months, this was a paper that we published in Brain last July, may also have increased extraaxial fluid. There's cerebral spinal fluid between the brain and the dura, and that actually may be a danger sign as well. So I think the practical take-home message is that if you have the child who's an infant sibling of a child with autism in your office and there's rapid head growth, I would monitor that child very, very closely. And we would advocate that it actually might make sense to do an MRI and actually look for this extraaxial fluid. Although conversely, we don't actually have anything to offer at this point in time, even if there was extraaxial fluid, other than perhaps getting that child into early intensive behavior therapy as soon as possible. But I think it can be an adjunct to your clinical judgment, but it's not a biomarker.
Last comment, Idle.
Thank you both very much. I have just a comment for David. I'm glad, I always see everything from racial point of view as a black person, and so I'm glad that out of your 366 children, that 18%, I think you said, were Hispanic and a little less were African Americans. And so I'm glad that researchers and scientists are including children of color, as America is a nation of immigrants and a nation of multi-ethnicity. And I'm also happy that you've included nonverbal children and older nonverbal children, because often that's a population that is missed or put aside because they're not cooperative and they're not compliant, not because they are low functioning, but maybe because there's a lot of things going on. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad that you said either put up or shut up. Yes. I like that. On the head size, I remember my son, I felt like you were talking about me, because the head was smaller at the beginning, and then around 6 months it got bigger. And I remember my pediatrician telling me, don't worry, he'll grow into it. And I remember he told me this might have been maybe when Jamie Foxx was a coming up star, and he said Jamie Foxx did an interview where he said he had a big head and he grew into it. And so your son is going to be an Academy Award winner. I was like, oh, it's not autism. He's going to be an actor. So that might be something for pediatricians, I think, like Anshu, to watch and see if that's happening, so then we can get those children into early intensive therapy. And for Allison, I was just wondering and thank you as well for your presentation. I was wondering if there is a way to make your website more culturally and linguistically appropriate, and if there is a way to outreach in communities of color, particularly African Americans and Hispanic Americans, if there was a way that you can do that. Thank you.
Do you want to? Okay. So this is a brand new project, and there's a lot that we know we need to do and want to do. So specifically to Anshu's point and Lynn's point, we absolutely want to reach out to the medical examiners. We want to get into the pediatricians' offices. We want to create more materials that target underrepresented populations, particularly in tissue donation. So that's all ahead. It's just, we're 6 weeks in. So those are all on our list of to-dos. But I agree.
I just want to comment to your point about working with nonverbal, sort of lower functioning individuals. And this has been really a wake-up call for me, because I think the basic scientists, or even the clinical scientist who's looking for basic mechanisms, will say, there's certain things you just can't do with a subset of the population, right? In fact, that's what the reviewers said. They said, this would be great if you could do it, but you can't do it. And having the behavior analyst work with the families and actually come up with what makes each one of these kids tick, and it was different for every kid. So it's time intensive, labor intensive, and for one girl, we actually had to have her come back 4 times for the training, and then we had her come back twice for the imaging. The imaging, we tried 7 tries, and she just wasn't being stable and whatever. We finally and the behavior analyst said, we're not being productive here, let's have her come out, let's have her do her thing. Her thing was actually rotating around in a chair like this, just going around. That was her reinforcement. She did that for a while. She went back into the scanner, and we got beautiful scans with 20 minutes of her holding still. And so what it says to me is I think it's sort of it's not a cop-out, but it's sort of, the knee-jerk response that you're just not going to be able to get and B, that I was mentioning, you know, if you watch the behavior assessment, when he's frustrated and he's banging his head on the table and he's self-injurious, you say, no way are you going to get this child into a scanner, right? But the behavior therapists were, again, Russian cartoons and pistachios was his thing, and they were able to sort of walk him in an experience that wasn't actually traumatic for him. He actually, in the end, enjoyed it. So I think, number one, to me, you know, we're going to keep pushing the envelope and trying to get the entire spectrum in the scanners and through all the other things we do at the Mind Institute. And number two, it makes me wonder, in terms of all of you who are involved in therapeutics, if we could devote as much time and effort as we devoted to these 6 kids to get them into the scanner for everyday life, you know, what would be the potential there, right? We're just not tapping that because we don't have the time or the effort or the resources. And so that was my other take-home message.
Well, this is a great discussion. I let it go on a little longer than we had planned, but I think it's really worth having a chance to talk about some of these issues, which, as you said at the beginning, are difficult to really dig into, but absolutely critical. It's part of our strategic plan. It's something we haven't done well. In addition, some of these suggestions about pediatricians and medical examiners, and in fact, researchers themselves. Why aren't we, after collecting all this other data on all of the subjects that are part of this big strategic plan, why aren't we reaching out to also enlist and get some kind of a donor agreement at the same time that we're collecting images and collecting genetics and everything else? It seems like it's a no-brainer in a sense. We need to start going in that direction. Thanks to both of you. Excellent presentations. We'll take a 10-minute break now and get started again right at 11:30.